Howdy, howdy, howdy. Welcome to another Collection Connection on the slowest growing channel on YouTube, Good Show Ponsonby. I play the game with my brother, Plastic Eric, who hosts his half of the game on his own channel, the Plastic Soundwave Cult. In every episode, I present an album from my record collection with the caveat that it has to share something in common with the album my brother had shown from his collection in the previous video. Really though, it's just an excuse to talk about records. Up today is an album that I have a long history with, even though it was Eric that whipped it out, and that is Howard Jones's second album from 1985, Dream into Action. I have a lot to say about that one, but by comparison, I know virtually nothing about the album I'm connecting to, which is the smash hit and first full album released by Billie Eilish, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go?, which came out in 2019. I will give you my impression of both records, but it is your job to see if you can figure out what that connection is. And if you have a guess, you can put it down in the comments, and the first correct answer will get a shout out in the next video. But first we need to reveal the connection between the previous pair of albums, those being Dexy's Midnight Runners, 2-Rye-A, and Howard Jones's Dream into Action. And the connection was the TKO Horns, founded by Big Jim Patterson, who was formerly of Dexy's Midnight Runners, left that band to form this horn group, and they were hired to play horns on, amongst other things, I think maybe one other track, but the Howard Jones single, Things Can Only Get Better. What a rip-roaring horn track that was. I'll touch on that again here in a moment, but nobody got that connection. And with that, we can get on with the show. Alright, so Eric talked about Howard Jones's Dream into Action. This is a super significant album for me personally. It is the album that I think of as the first album that I bought with my own money. It certainly wasn't the first album that I owned, but every so often, as a kid, we were Air Force kids. We'd go to swap meet on base, and my mom would give me $5 to go find something to buy, and I would buy a cassette at one of the vendors there. So I had just a handful of things, mostly Phil Collins and Genesis related things. But in the 80s, this was 1985, we were back in the States by then, and I was in the habit of listening to Shadoe Stevens count down the top 40 hits of the week. And When Things Can Only Get Better was a hit, I was hooked on that song, and I loved the horn line on that song. I couldn't get enough of it, and the way the show often went, as a song started to slide back down the countdown, they wouldn't necessarily play the entire song, they would just play a little snippet of it. And as that started to happen with Things Can Only Get Better, I was incensed. I'm like, I had waited all week. I wanted to hear the song again back in the day. It was about the only time you could predict, that you would hear a song if you knew that it was a hit. But I kind of immediately went to my mom and said, hey, I want to go to the record store because I want to buy this album. I got the money. And she took me to the local music store, and I bought a copy of it. And so, in a lot of ways, meaningful ways, that is my first album that I bought with my own money. Not only that, but it is an album I believe I've purchased 4 times. Rare Air, that I think maybe only Peter Gabriel's So has matched up with, and maybe XTC's Skylarking. Albums that I have purchased 4 times. I bought the vinyl initially, and then I bought the cassette, and when I moved to CDs, I bought it on CD, and then most recently in 2018, Cherry Red reissued some of Howard Jones's albums, and this is the most recent copy. I still have my other CD copy, but that doesn't get filed. My duplicates don't get filed in behind me on the wall here. This was a 2 CD expansion from Cherry Red, as I mentioned, that had remixes and some B-sides, and included the re-recorded version of No One Is to Blame that had Phil Collins on drums, which Eric had mentioned in his video, that became his biggest hit, which is kind of sad because I think it's a little schmaltzy. I'm not in love with that song, either version of it, really. The album was interesting in that it seemed like every time I bought it, it sort of had a different configuration of songs on it. The initial UK release had a song called Specialty and Why Look for the Key on it, and the American version dropped those two songs in favor of songs called Like to Get to Know You Well and Bounce Right Back, which in England had been released independently as a single. So even in the 80s, the record companies were still up to their shenanigans of sort of creating whatever song lineup they wanted, I guess. But I got the initial version that had Like to Get to Know You Well and Bounce Right Back, I think, and then a later version that had Why Look for the Key and Specialty, and then later version still that kind of had both sets but rearranged the running order a little bit. So it's all very confusing. It is a significant album to me, even though I don't include it amongst my favorite albums when I'm listing my favorite albums. Very significant, and I love still to this day. Things can only get better. And I like Life in a Day, Life in One Day. And I still think it's an interesting album that I can listen to from beginning to end, but it isn't necessarily chock full of my favorite tunes. They're just songs that I like, that I think are interesting, but are so ingrained in my personage because it was one of the things that I had when I had less than 10 albums to listen to. So they're all kind of etched into me, even though they're varying degrees of how much I love the songs. But it was a big album for me personally. With that said, it was bizarrely difficult to try and find a connection to it. Howard Jones was a synth pop act who, on his first album, did everything. Kind of one of the first to really do that, handle everything. There was a saxophone brought in, I think, for one track, for Pearl in the Shell maybe. And everything else was written, played by Howard Jones. Dream into Action is a little bit of an evolution on that because he brought in the TKO horns, as we mentioned, as the connection, and also Aphrodisiac for backing vocals, a singing group comprised of 3 female singers, one of whom was Karen Wheeler, who would much later become famous for singing Soul to Soul's biggest hits, Back to Life and Keep on Moving. So you may recognize her from that. But it was still just kind of him. And so I really leaned into trying to find an album that contained a song that was re-recorded for the single version of a track, because it was full-on re-recorded. No One Is to Blame, with Phil Collins on drums, some guitar, bass, and a different arrangement, different producer. Phil Collins and Hugh Padgham produced that single, whereas Rupert Hines, I think, something Hines, produced the album version. And man, I was trying hard to come up with something there. I thought about the song Assault and Battery, which is about eating meat, not eating meat specifically, laying out a story about how, you know, the animals on the farm are really no different, you know, than any other animals, and when they show up on your table, they're still those animals. But the only other real sort of pro-vegetarian song I could think of was Meat is Murder from the Smiths, which I believe we've done that album, and I really wanted to try and get out of the 1980s and out of England. And with the re-recording, the best thing I could come up with was Fine Young Cannibals. The album version and the single versions of Funny How Love Is are very different, even though I think it's technically still a remix because I believe it uses the same vocal, even though there's major sort of reverb and processing put on the vocals, and the arrangement is completely different. But that was not only still in England, not only still in 1985, but it was also still in like Birmingham. So I can't get away from from England in the 80s. But in the end, I did come up with a connection to something entirely different that hopefully will make you scratch your chin and say, what do those have in common? And that is Billie Eilish, which I'm showing the back of. Huzzah. Billie Eilish, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? This is a record that I confess the only reason I even own it is because my youngest child handed it to me when we were in a record store at one time, and I thought, hey, great, man, you want to buy some music? And so I was all for it. I had heard of Billie Eilish at that point, and I had heard Bad Guy and Bury a Friend. So I was familiar with those two songs, but I still sort of had her confused with, not that I thought that she was Lorde, but for some reason, I think because of Lorde, I thought that she was Australian, Billie Eilish, but she's not. She's from LA, so she's an American artist, so we're out of England. And yeah, somebody who I just had a passing familiarity with a couple of songs. Apparently she had been releasing singles for a little while, gaining some notoriety before this first album came out. A lot of what I'm going to have to say is stuff that I figured out in research after I picked this album. I was aware that she worked very closely with her brother Phineas. That name stuck in my head, and the two of them basically make the albums together. So it's very much sort of made at home records, and the sound reflects that. I think it's not bad, but I didn't love it enough that I would have bought it. And eventually my kid, who is in the habit of buying record store shirts, like merch, which I love, said on that particular day later, yeah, I just feel like maybe it's a bit of a cop-out to buy the shirt for the record store if you don't actually buy any music there. So they weren't necessarily interested in the CD. It was just an artist, Billie Eilish, that they were familiar with and somewhat liked, but they're pretty much a Spotify kid, but I love that they love the record store shirts, so I'm always buying them. They have at least a half dozen shirts from record stores around the country. But I have remarkable skill in avoiding, not even consciously avoiding, but just not encountering is probably a better way to put it, the big hits of the day. I'm not seeking to not hear songs, but sort of the way I live my life, listening mostly to my record collection and one particular radio station that doesn't necessarily play the pop hits of today. It's a little bit more independently curated, so it plays all eras up to the present day, but more indie artists. And so big, massive hits, can come and go without me ever really hearing them or being aware of them. I am familiar with like Shake It Off and some of Taylor Swift's catalog, but like Anti-Hero, I don't know that I ever heard. I came to recognize that, hey, it's me, it's the problem, I'm the problem, it's me, as being from that. But I still didn't know the context in which so it's like I just never encountered it in life. And other great big songs like that. Despacito, I know, is like a huge thing. I don't know that I've ever heard it. You think, how can you not encounter it? It's not hard. You just don't listen to that kind of thing. It doesn't get fed into your algorithm and whatever. So the fact that I was a little bit aware of Billie Eilish was kind of an up thing, but I bought it for my kid and I didn't really follow up on it until I had this connection that I thought of, and hey, here's a chance to break out of our England in the 80s rut. So we got America in the 2010s. And listening to it, it goes a little bit, I find her vocals a little bit tough because it's almost so whispery most of the time that it makes me wonder, like if you're playing it at home and you're mixing it, you can just mix the vocals real loud on top of it. It makes me wonder how she performs, if her vocals have to be turned up or if she sings a little more full-throatedly in concert, because it's just such a sort of hiding in the closet almost, singing, just real quiet so nobody will hear you. That's kind of what it feels like half the time. As the album went on, it is, I think, 14 songs, but really 13 songs because the first track is a nothing thing that's just a sound snippet. The last bit of the album, starting with, I have no idea how you say it, Ilo Milo, no idea, on to the end. The songs, the arrangements are a little more traditional. I am aware now that Phineas Ferb will do a lot of kind of field recording of sounds to turn them into music so that it's sort of non-traditional, very put together on the computer kind of recordings. But they feel a little more traditional, and her voice when she is harmonizing with herself is very nice. And when the edge is off, it feels like the edge is off a little bit. I think that's the other thing that maybe turns me off. Maybe I'm too old for that kind of edginess of like bad guy and bury a friend. A repetition of I want to end me. It makes me roll my eyes a little bit if I'm honest. I have a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to that kind of presentation. So with that said, it was okay. Some of the vocal treatments, like early on, the kind of the singing through the fan kind of choppiness on the vocals, didn't like that. Although it was done on a later song, maybe My Strange Addiction. I'm not sure. It may have been Ilo Milo or whatever, where it's done in a little bit of a slower rhythm, that sort of singing into the fan choppiness, and I felt like it worked a lot better. So I don't know. I'm kind of giving you almost what amounts to my first impression of this album, even though it's one that I've owned for a few years now. I just never really gave it a spin. It's not made for me, which is fine. I think she's interesting in that she's a 2-time Oscar winner already, the youngest person, actor or not. She won Best Song Oscars for both the Barbie song, What Am I Made For, is that what it was called, and the No Time to Die theme song from James Bond. And she won a slew of Grammys already, and so she's a big artist. And I did enjoy, actually, when she hosted on SNL. I thought she was very fun and lively, and sort of broke my expectation that she was kind of an overly dark person who, I know I was never goth specifically, but I certainly had my period, where The Cure and the Smiths were like preaching gospel to me. And so it felt like, she's doing that for today's generation, which is great and fine and good, just not aimed at me. But the songs are okay. I wouldn't complain about listening to them again. And as I said, kind of by the end of the album, the songs feel a little less edgy, pretty, and more conventionally arranged. And she does some harmonizing, and I like it pretty well. So with that, you want to tell me how I'm wrong, or something else about Billie Eilish that I should know that you think might help me appreciate her music, inspire me to buy either of the 2 albums. I know that she's had 2, including one very recent new release, but I haven't heard anything from them. That's not true. I have heard Lunch. I did encounter that, but I never heard anything off of her second record, so I fell back into that hole of I wasn't looking for it, and it didn't come find me, so I just didn't hear it kind of category. But I have heard Lunch, which I don't know that I'm crazy about, but anyway. If you think you know what the connection would be between Howard Jones's Dream into Action and Billie Eilish, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? You can leave that guess down in the description. As a hint, I will say that it is about the artists, so the specific album is irrelevant. It is something that applies to each of the artists, and as such, these are the albums that we owned, but one could have picked anything from their discographies because it is about the artists themselves. So there's your hint, and with that, you can look for Eric's video on Monday where he will connect to Billie Eilish, and yeah, that's all I got. So I thank you for watching. Bye-bye. Good show, Ponsonby.